She was standing in the street with one trunk and 14 cents when the clock on the church tower struck 10. The man who had owned the boarding house had not been unkind about it. He had simply been accurate. Her rent was 6 weeks gone, and his patience had run its full length. This is not a story about a woman who was saved by a man who arrived in time. It is a story about a woman who was already walking toward something she could not yet name, and a man who found her there, in the wreckage, and did not look away. The trunk was not heavy. That was the worst part of it in a way, that everything she had left in the world fit inside a box she could lift herself. Maren Ellis stood on the packed dirt of Caldwell's main street in the hard October morning and held the handle of that trunk and looked at the road leading out of town and told herself plainly, "You have walked out of worse than this." She was not certain that was true, but she said it, in saying it was something. She had 3 days before the stage left for the next county seat, and no money for the fare regardless. She had no family within 500 miles, and no friend in Caldwell who had not already looked away when the boarding house door closed behind her. She had a sewing kit, a good wool coat that was becoming less good by the season, a pair of boots with the left sole beginning to separate, and a small leather portfolio containing every letter of professional reference she had accumulated in 4 years of teaching school in 2 different territories. She also had, tucked inside the portfolio, a notice she had torn from the land board window 3 weeks prior, before she had understood how badly she needed it. The notice read, "Wanted, Homestead Caretaker, Roan Creek Property, 6 miles east. Cabin requires repair. Compensation, room and board, first season. Inquire Kane." She had not inquired. She had been, 3 weeks ago, 1 week behind on rent rather than 6, and the difference between 1 week and 6 weeks was the difference between a woman who had options and a woman standing in a street with 14 cents and a light trunk. She understood that distinction with the particular clarity of someone who has recently crossed the line between the two. She picked up the trunk and began walking east. The road out of Caldwell was straight and flat, and the wind came off the plains from the north, cold and without mercy. She walked for 2 hours. The trunk was lighter than it should have been, and heavier than it needed to be at the same time, and by the time a wagon track broke off the main road toward a creek line, she had to stop and set it down and breathe. The property announced itself not as a ranch, but as a ruin in progress. She saw the cabin first, a single-story structure of weathered pine. The roof on the east end visibly caved, the front step broken through, one window boarded with old planking that had warped away from the frame and left a gap wide enough for wind and weather to move freely. The chimney was intact. The walls were intact on 3 sides. The 4th side had a section of boards gone entirely near the roofline, the interior open to the sky. It was not fit for habitation. Not yet. A man was on the roof. He was working alone, moving with the unhurried economy of someone who has done this kind of labor so long it no longer requires thought. He had not heard her come up the track. She stood at the edge of the yard with her trunk at her feet and watched him set a board and drive nails and did not speak, because she had learned that announcing yourself to a working man before he was ready to be interrupted was a reliable way to begin a conversation with his irritation rather than his attention. He came down the ladder after another 10 minutes and turned and saw her and went still. He was perhaps 42, perhaps older. The frontier aged men differently than towns did, and she had learned not to guess too precisely. Broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with the kind of face that had been weathered into a permanent seriousness. His eyes were dark and steady, and they moved over her once, taking in the trunk, the coat, the road dust on her boots. "You're lost," he said. "I'm not," she said. "Are you Kane?" A pause. "I am. I've come about the caretaker position." She held out the torn notice. He looked at it. He looked at her. "That notice is 3 weeks old. I'm aware. The position hasn't been filled." "I can see that," she said with a single glance at the open roof section. "From here." Something moved through his expression, not quite amusement, but the shadow of a man who has not expected that and does not know what to do with it. He took the notice from her hand and looked at it as if verifying it was, in fact, his own handwriting. "I said the cabin requires repair," he said. "You did. It requires more than repair. I can see that too. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved between them, and she held her coat closed at the throat and did not look away from him, because looking away would have cost her something she could not afford. "Room and board," he said. "First season. That's what the notice says." "Yes. There's no room yet. The cabin isn't livable on the east end." "What about the west end?" He studied her. "It's cold. It has a roof." Another pause, longer. He looked at the trunk. "What are you running from? A boarding house that ran out of patience and a town that ran out of work. Nothing dramatic. You walked 6 miles. I walked 2. I hired a man with a mule for the first 4. She had not. But the pride of the thing required it, and he did not need to know the detail. The position is still open. I'm here. I can cook adequately, I can keep records, I can turn a hammer. Tell me what the cabin needs and I'll tell you honestly whether I can manage it." He looked at her for a moment that stretched itself thin as wire. Then he said, "The west room has a sound floor and a working iron stove. There's a pallet and a blanket. It's not a hotel. I didn't ask for a hotel. You'd be working for board. No wages first season unless the operation shows. I understand the terms." He picked up her trunk without asking. She followed him through the broken front step, stepping over it as he did, and into the west room of the cabin. It was small and cold and smelled of pine resin and old ash, but the floor was solid and the stove was iron and the walls held. A single window, intact, faced west, and through it the afternoon plains stretched out in the long flat gold of late October. Someone had stacked firewood against the interior wall, enough for a week, maybe 2. He set her trunk down. He looked at the room. He looked at her. "There's water at the creek, 50 yards east. I'll get a barrel fitted to the porch by end of week so you're not hauling every morning." He said it the way a man announces a practical solution, not a kindness. "I'll be on the roof until dark. There's dried beans in the tin on the shelf and salt pork in the cold box outside the east wall, the end that's still standing." He turned to leave. "Kane," she said. He stopped. "What broke the roof?" "Ice storm last February. The east ridge beam came down. I've been getting to it when I can." "How long have you been working it alone?" A pause. "Since March." 8 months. She looked at the cabin around her, at the evidence of a man doing the work of 3 people with the hands of 1, and said nothing more. He went back to the roof. She found the beans and the salt pork and started a fire in the iron stove and began making something that would be hot by the time he came in, because that was the first useful thing she could do, and she intended to begin being useful immediately. The stove drew well. The room warmed by degrees. Through the window, the plains went from gold to rust to the pale violet of early dusk, and she could hear the occasional sound of a hammer above her and the creak of the cabin settling in the wind. She had a roof. It was incomplete, but it was a roof. She had a stove and a fire and food for tonight, and a position that paid in shelter rather than wages, and a man who had not yet decided what to make of her. She had made worse arrangements. She intended to make this one count. By the 3rd morning, she had identified 6 things wrong with the cabin that were not the roof. She had found them the way she found everything, by moving through a space with her eyes open and her hands willing. The stove flue had a partial blockage that was venting smoke sideways rather than up. She cleared it with a length of wire and a rag, and the stove drew 30% better immediately. The west wall had a gap at the base behind the woodpile that was letting cold air in at floor level. She found old wool batting in the supply chest and sealed it. The door hung wrong on its upper hinge, 1 pin loose, and had been letting in a strip of wind every time it settled. She reset the pin with a nail punch she found in the tool chest. She fixed none of these things dramatically. She fixed them in the order she found them and said nothing about any of them. On the 2nd evening, Elias Kane came in from the roof and sat down at the table, and the room was notably warmer than it had been the night before, and the door did not drag when he opened it, and the smoke went straight up the flue when she stoked the stove. And he looked at the stove, and then at the door, and then at the wall. He said nothing. He ate. He looked at the room once more before he went to his side of the cabin, the east end, which now had 3 full walls and a patched roof and a pallet he had moved back in on the second night. In the morning, she found a second water barrel fitted to the porch. She had not asked. He had said by end of week. It was day 2. She noted this without comment. On the 4th morning, Elias was at the south end of the property mending fence. She could see him from the cabin window, a distant figure moving along the post line, when a wagon came up the track from the Caldwell Road. 2 men. The driver was a heavy-set man in a coat too fine for this road, and beside him, a younger man with the flat, patient expression of someone employed to witness things. She stepped out onto the porch. The heavy-set man pulled up and looked at the cabin, and then at her, with the measuring expression of a man cataloging an unexpected variable. "Looking for Kane," he said. "He's on the property," she said. "Can I take a message?" The man's eyes moved over the cabin. Over her. "Hargrove," he said, by way of introduction that was also a statement of precedence. "I hold the land note on this property. I'll speak to Kane directly. Of course, I'll let him know you've called." She did not move from the porch step. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. "You the new wife?" "I'm the property caretaker," she said, "and you're welcome to wait." He did not look pleased about either of those statements. The younger man wrote something in a small book. Elias came up from the fence line 10 minutes later, and the exchange between him and Hargrove was short and had the quality of a conversation that had happened before, in different words but the same shape. Hargrove wanted the first quarter payment of the land note. Elias said it would be ready by month's end. Hargrove said month's end was 3 weeks, and the property had shown no improvement sufficient to justify continued forbearance. Morin, standing at the edge of the porch, said, "What does the note require for continued forbearance?" Hargrove looked at her. Elias looked at her. "Demonstrated habitability," Hargrove said, "per the original terms. The cabin was assessed as uninhabitable at last survey." "When was the last survey?" A pause. "August. Then the assessment is 2 months out of date." She held the door open. "Would you like to come inside?" The stove was going. The floor was swept. Both windows were intact. The flue drew cleanly, and the room held heat, and the door opened and closed without difficulty. Hargrove walked through it with the expression of a man adjusting expectations he had arrived with. The young man with the notebook wrote considerably more than he had before. When they left, Hargrove said from the wagon seat, "Month's end, Kane. Bring the payment to my office." "He will," Marin said. The wagon turned down the track. Dust rose and settled. Elias stood in the yard and looked at the road for a moment, and then turned and looked at her on the porch with an expression she was beginning to learn, the one that appeared when she did something he had not anticipated from the direction he was looking. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I didn't do it for appreciation. I did it because a failed forbearance serves neither of us." He was quiet. "Hargrove will come back." "Yes." "With different questions. We should have the payment ready and the east room finished before he does." She looked at the roofline. "How many days to close the east section?" 3, if the weather holds. Then we have 17 days after that. That's enough time." He studied her. "You've been here 4 days. I've been watching carefully for 4 days," she said. "There is a difference. This is Dusty Vows, where stories like hers live. Women who arrived with nothing and built something that could not be taken. Men who stopped building alone. If you want the next story the moment it arrives, subscribe now." Then, back to the cabin. The weather held. The east roof was closed in 2 days, not 3. She was on the ladder herself on the second morning, handing boards up, and he had not asked her to and had not told her not to. And by mid-afternoon, the last section was nailed, and the cabin was, for the first time since February, whole. She came down the ladder and stood in the yard, and looked at the roofline, and felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a completed thing. Elias came down behind her and stood beside her, and they both looked up at it for a moment without speaking. "It's sound," she said. "It'll hold the winter," he said. They were standing close, ladder close, the proximity of shared labor, and neither of them moved away immediately. and the silence between them was the specific silence of two people who have been working toward the same thing and have arrived at it at the same moment. He moved first, back to the tool chest, methodical, beginning the cleanup with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything. She watched him for a moment and then went inside to start the stove. That evening, Ruth Holt from the neighboring homestead came to the door with a jar of preserved tomatoes and the frank assessment of a woman who has been watching from a distance and has decided to form an opinion. "You're the one who faced down Hargrove on the porch," she said when Maren opened the door. "Word moves fast. In this county it moves faster than weather." Ruth looked past her into the room. "He let you stay. I took a position. He honored it." Ruth made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Elias Kane has turned away 3 men who came looking for work this season, said he didn't need the trouble." She looked at Maren directly. "He let you stay." She offered the tomatoes and left without coming inside, which Maren understood was its own form of respect, the visit long enough to make a point, short enough to make it once. Tobias, the only hand still working the small herd Elias kept on the property's south acres, found Maren the following morning replacing a section of fence rail she had noticed listing on the east property line. He was 60 years old and had the unhurried quality of a man who has seen many arrangements come and go and has learned to evaluate them by what they produce rather than what they announce. He watched her work for a moment. Then he picked up the other end of the rail and held it steady while she drove the nail. "He hasn't asked anyone for help in 8 years, Tobias said. "He didn't ask me," she said. "No," Tobias said. "He didn't have to." 3 weeks into the arrangement, Hargrove came back. He came in the early evening, unannounced, with the same young man and a third person she did not recognize, a woman in town dress who carried herself with the purposeful blankness of a legal witness. The payment was not what Hargrove was there for. Maren understood that before he opened his mouth. He was there because someone had told him about the repairs and the habitability assessment and the woman on the porch who had spoken to him as though she had standing to do it. He was there because Elias Kane had been on the verge of default for 8 months and suddenly was not, and men like Hargrove did not absorb that kind of reversal without looking for its source. "There are questions about the legitimacy of the caretaker arrangement," Hargrove said, in the main room, where the stove was going and both windows were clean and the floor showed the evidence of regular occupation. "A single woman on a man's property, unmarried, no formal contract on record, the county land board has concerns." "The county land board has a copy of the caretaker agreement," Maren said. "I filed it myself 2 weeks ago. Mr. Kane signed it. It is on record with the clerk." Hargrove's expression did not change, but the young man with the notebook looked up. "The agreement is standard for a first-season homestead caretaker position," she continued. "The terms are room and board, first season, contingent on property improvement. The improvement is documented. The habitability assessment as of last week shows the cabin in full working order. The land note payment will be at your office by Friday." She looked at him calmly. "Is there another question?" There was a long silence in the room. Elias was standing behind her and to her left, the same position he had taken the morning with Hargrove at the porch, and he said nothing, and his silence had the same quality it always had in these moments, a wall, present, solid, not moving. The woman in town dress had not written anything. Hargrove said, "Friday then," and left. When the wagon was gone, Elias stood in the room for a moment without speaking. The fire in the stove popped once. Maren began clearing the table. "You filed the contract 2 weeks ago," he said. "I drafted it the first week. You signed it. I filed it at the clerk's office the following Tuesday when I rode into town for the supply list. You didn't tell me. You were on the roof." She looked at him. "I knew you would have told me it wasn't necessary." A pause. "It wasn't. It became necessary tonight," she said. "That's the nature of preparation. You don't know which document saves you until someone arrives to challenge you without one." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them threw warm light, and beyond it, the cabin was shadowed and still, and outside, the October wind moved across the plains in long, cold sweeps. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. 4 years teaching school in 2 territories. You learn to document everything when the people above you are waiting for a reason to dismiss you. She set the last cup on the shelf. I was dismissed twice, both times for reasons that had nothing to do with my teaching. The third position I kept for 2 years because I kept records so thorough there was nothing they could use. He said nothing for a moment. Then, what happened to the third position? The school board consolidated with the county district. The new district brought its own teachers. She looked at the window. None of it was personal. That was the thing I had to keep reminding myself. None of it was ever personal. It was only circumstance, and circumstance could be prepared for, and preparation was the only kind of control I had ever actually held. He was quiet. She heard him move, not away, but not toward her either, only a shift of weight, the small movement of a man adjusting to something inside himself. Maren, he said, the first time he had said her name. Just that, her name in his voice, quiet and direct, carrying something she could not name except to feel it, the way you feel a change in temperature before you identify its source. He did not follow it with anything immediately. He stood with it, and she stood with it, and the fire in the stove threw its steady light, and the cabin around them held the warmth they had both built into it over 3 weeks of shared, unhurried work. The payment Friday, he said finally. I'll need to ride to the Creek Surveyor's office first. There's a boundary question Hargrove may try to use next time. I'll come, she said. You know land boundary documentation? Matthew, my late husband, was a surveyor. I kept his records for 4 years. A pause. I know what to look for. He looked at her again with the particular expression she had come to recognize, the one that appeared when she produced a competence he had not expected from the direction he was looking. Not surprise exactly. Something more deliberate than surprise. The expression of a man who has been building a picture and has just received a piece that changes its shape. He said her name differently that time, and they both felt it, even if neither of them could have named precisely what had shifted. Tell me, which moment did it for you, the porch, the contract, or the name? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone. Now, back to the cabin. The ride to the surveyor's office was early and cold, frost still on the grass, their breath visible in the morning air. She found the boundary discrepancy in the original survey record in 11 minutes, a clerical error that had been shifting the eastern fence line 15 feet into Kane property for 6 years, a small enough error to be overlooked and large enough, if Hargrove had discovered it, to use as leverage in a boundary dispute. She copied the relevant measurements and had them certified by the county clerk before they left. On the main street of Caldwell, outside the land office, a woman named Grace Whitmore, who distributed town opinion the way weather distributed rain, freely and without preference, stopped and looked at Maren and said, "You're the one from the Kane property." "I am," Maren said. Grace looked her over with the frank assessment of someone who has formed a preliminary opinion and is verifying it against the source. "Hargrove came back from that property looking like he'd stepped in something," she said. "He stepped in a prepared argument," Maren said. "They do that sometimes." Grace Whitmore looked at her for another moment. Then she said, with the tone of a woman revising a judgment, "I heard you walked out here from town on your own. I did. With a trunk. It wasn't heavy." Grace nodded slowly. Then she stepped aside and let them pass and said nothing further, which in Caldwell, Maren had learned, was its own kind of approval. Elias beside her said nothing until they were back at the wagon. Then, without preamble, Hargrove knows about the survey error. I assumed he did. He was going to use it in January when the payment came due, force a boundary arbitration and use the legal costs to push the note into default. He can't use it now. The correction is on record. She looked at the wagon. How many other documents on this property has he been watching? Elias was quiet for a moment, more than I realized. Then we go through all of them. He looked at her. That's weeks of work. Yes, she said. It is. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he nodded. One short, certain nod, the nod of a man who has made a decision and made it without the performance of having made it. They drove back in the particular quiet of two people who have established, without ceremony, that they are going to do a thing together. The weeks that followed had the quality of a season turning, not dramatic, but irreversible. They went through every document on the property. She found 3 more irregularities: a lien that had been satisfied but not formally released, a grazing right that had lapsed through non-registration and needed renewal, and a water use agreement that Hargrove had quietly allowed to expire. She drafted the release, filed the renewal, and reinstated the water agreement with a county stamp before Hargrove's office had time to act on its absence. Tobias, watching all of this from the peripheral position of a man who has worked a property long enough to understand its rhythms, said to her one morning at the fence line, "He's been working this land alone since his wife died. 6 years. He didn't ask for help from anyone." "I know," she said. "He's not good at being helped. He's getting better." Tobias looked at the cabin, at the sound roof and the clean windows and the smoke going straight from the chimney. "Yes," he said, "he is." The first hard snow came on a Thursday, 2 days before the second land note payment was due. 3 inches overnight and the temperature dropping. Myron was up before dawn and had the stove going and coffee on when she heard Elias on the east side of the cabin checking the new roof section. She knew, because she had already checked it herself at first light and found it holding cleanly. He came in through the door and stopped at the smell of coffee and the sight of 2 cups already on the table. He sat down. She poured. They drank in the particular silence of 2 people who have stopped requiring conversation to occupy the same space. After a while he said, without looking at her, "I drove past this property for 3 years before I bought it. Used to stop on the road and look at it." He turned the cup in his hands. "It was already half broken when I bought it. I paid less for it because of that. I thought I could fix it faster than it turned out I could." She waited. "I fixed what I could see," he said. "I didn't know what I was missing." She said, "You fixed the structure. The structure was always sound." He looked at her. "The walls held," she said. "The chimney held. The floor. Those are the things you can't repair after the fact. You either have them or you don't. You had them." She looked at the room around them. The rest was detail work. He was quiet for a long moment. "You walked 6 miles to a broken cabin with 14 cents in your coat." She looked at her coffee. 2 miles, she said. 2. I hired a man with a mule for the first 4. A pause. Then, for the first time since she had arrived, Elias Kane smiled. It was small and brief and entirely unguarded, and it arrived and departed before he had the chance to manage it, and she felt the warmth of it the way you feel the first honest warmth after a long cold, not overwhelming, only certain. He stood and put on his coat. "I'm checking the south fence before the snow deepens. I'll start on the February ledger records," she said. "There's one more document I want to verify before the payment Friday." He stopped at the door. He turned, and he looked at her, at the table and the coffee cups and the ledger already open beside her hand, with an expression she would remember later as the moment she understood something she had not yet named. "Myron," he said, the second time. Her name in his voice, carrying everything the first time had only suggested: the 6 weeks, the roof, the documents, the snow on Thursday mornings and coffee on the table, and the weight of a trunk that was not heavy because she had already lost everything it could have held. "Go check your fence," she said quietly. "I'll be here when you get back." He stood in the doorway for one more second. Then he went. The payment was delivered Friday. Hargrove received it without comment, which was the sound of a man whose next argument had been removed before he could make it. The boundary correction was on record. The lien was released. The water agreement was current. The grazing right was renewed. There was nothing left to challenge. On the road back from Hargrove's office, Elias pulled the wagon off the track at the top of the rise where the whole of the Roan Creek property was visible. The cabin, the repaired roof, the barn, the south fence running straight and sound across the flat land, smoke rising clean and straight from the chimney into the cold, clear air. He looked at it for a long time. She looked at it too, and thought of the morning she had walked up this track with a trunk and 14 cents, and the torn notice in her pocket, and the man on the roof who had not offered his hand, and the room that was cold, and the stove that drew wrong, and the floor that was solid, and the walls that held. She had walked toward a broken thing. She had understood, she thought now, even then, that broken things with sound walls were worth more than perfect things with nothing underneath. "I want to offer wages," Elias said, "starting the second season, not just board. We haven't survived the first season yet," she said. "We will." He said it without performance. "A fact," stated plainly. She looked at him. He was still looking at the property, at the cabin, and the smoke and the fence line and all of it, and his face had the expression of a man who has been carrying something a very long time and has just, quietly, set it down. "All right," she said. He looked at her then. The full, unhurried look she had come to know, the one that said he was seeing her exactly as she was and not arranging what he saw into something more comfortable. "Maren," he said. "The third time. The last time." Her name said with the weight of a man who has stopped rationing something he can no longer pretend he does not feel. He reached across the bench and placed his hand over hers where it rested on her knee, and his hand was warm in the cold morning air and entirely certain. She turned her palm up and held it. The smoke went straight from the chimney. The fence line ran clean. The cabin sat solid and complete on the Roan Creek land, and the sky above it was the hard, clear blue of late autumn opening into winter, and below it, two people had stopped surviving alone. She proved that a woman with nothing can build something worth keeping, if she knows what holds and what doesn't. He proved that a man who fixes what he can see sometimes needs someone else to find what he's been missing. Tell me, would you have walked 6 miles to that broken cabin or turned back at the road? Leave your answer below. Next week, a woman named Clara rides into a border town carrying a deed to a ranch she has never seen, signed over to her by a dying stranger on a stagecoach, and the man who was supposed to inherit it is already waiting at the gate. Subscribe now so you do not miss the next story.